Number 1, the family tree nobody told you about. You have been lied to about extinction, not maliciously, not conspiratorially, just by the way the story gets told, the asteroid, the fire, the darkness, the end. Every dinosaur dead. 66 million years ago, a rock 6 miles wide hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and the dinosaurs were over. That version is wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. The dinosaurs are not over. There are roughly 11,000 species of them alive right now. More species than all living mammals combined. They live on every continent, including Antarctica. One of them probably walked past your window this morning. The reason you don't think of them as dinosaurs is entirely a naming problem, and the naming problem has a history worth knowing. Because once you know it, you cannot unknow it, and you will never look at a pigeon, a hawk, a chicken, or a hummingbird the same way again. Here's the actual family tree. Dinosaurs split into 2 main groups: the ornitheschians, your triceratops, your stegosaurus, your iguanodon, and the saurischians. The saurischians split further. One branch produced the long-necked giants, the sauropods, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Argentinosaurus. The other branch produced the theropods, the bipedal mostly meat-eating dinosaurs, T. rex Allosaurus velociraptor. Within theropods deep in the family tree, a small-bodied feathered subgroup began to appear in the fossil record somewhere around 150 to 165 million years ago. That subgroup did not go extinct. It is still here. It is called aves. You call them birds. Birds are not the descendants of dinosaurs in the way that you are descended from an ape ancestor. That phrasing implies separation, a transition from one thing to another. Birds are a subclade of dinosaurs, the same way bats are a subclade of mammals. Bats are mammals, birds are dinosaurs. Both statements are equally precisely technically true. The asteroid 66 million years ago wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, the T-Rex lineage, the Triceratops lineage, the sauropods. It did not wipe out the avian dinosaurs. It filtered them brutally. Most of the birds alive at the time of the impact also died, but a small number survived, and what came from those survivors is the 11,000 species of birds on the planet today. This is not a metaphor. This is not a poetic stretch. It is the scientific consensus supported by the fossil record, by molecular phylogenetics, by comparative anatomy, and by the detailed genetic work of the last 30 years. The question is, how did we not know this? How did the connection between dinosaurs and birds sit unresolved, disputed, forgotten, and buried for nearly 150 years after the first fossil that pointed directly at it was dug out of the ground? That fossil has a name, and its story is messier than the textbooks admit. Number 2, the fossil in the wrong drawer. The proof existed in 1861. The field took a century to accept it. In August 1861, a limestone slab was pulled from a quarry near Solnhofen in Bavaria. The Solnhofen limestone is one of the great fossil deposits on Earth, a fine-grained, quiet lagoon sediment that preserves detail at a resolution most rock formations cannot match. It had already produced beautiful fossils of fish, pterosaurs, and insects. What came out of the quarry in 1861 was something different. The slab showed the imprint of feathers, clear, unmistakable asymmetric flight feathers preserved in limestone 150 million years old. But attached to the feathered body were features that no modern bird possesses: a long, bony tail, clawed fingers on the wings, and in later specimens, teeth. This was Archaeopteryx, and it arrived in the scientific world too. Years after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, at the precise moment when naturalists were desperately searching for transitional fossils to either prove or disprove Darwin's argument. Richard Owen, the British anatomist who coined the word dinosaur, and who was at the time Darwin's most influential critic, examined the London specimen and argued it was simply an unusual ancient bird, not a transitional form, not a link between dinosaurs and birds, just a bird. Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's champion, argued the opposite. He laid Archaeopteryx next to a small theropod dinosaur called Compsognathus, also found at Solnhofen, and pointed out feature after feature. They shared the hip structure, the leg bones, the foot. He argued in 1868 that birds were modified dinosaurs. Huxley was correct, but Huxley was not the one who won the argument in the short term. Through the late 19th and early 20th century, the dinosaur-bird hypothesis fell out of scientific fashion. The dominant alternative view, championed first by Harry Seeley and later by Gerhard Heilmann, held that birds descended from more generalized archosaurs, not from dinosaurs specifically. Heilmann's 1926 book, The Origin of Birds, was thorough, beautifully illustrated, and highly persuasive. It set the debate back by roughly 40 years. Part of the issue was anatomical. Birds have wishbones, the furcula, the fused clavicles. Heilmann argued that no known theropod dinosaur had clavicles, and since a structure cannot be lost and then regained, birds could not have descended from theropods. The problem was that Heilmann was working with incomplete material. Theropod clavicles and furculae existed in the fossil record. They just had not been properly identified yet. In science, the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes it is evidence that you have not found the right rock yet. The right rock took another 40 years. Number 3, the man who got laughed at. He found the answer in Montana in 1964. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. John Ostrom was a paleontologist at Yale. In 1964, excavating in Montana's Cloverleaf Formation, his team found something that did not match the then prevailing image of dinosaurs as slow, cold-blooded tail, dragging swamp-dwelling giants. The animal they found was Deinonychus antiropus. You know its relatives, the velociraptors? From Jurassic Park, which were modeled directly on Deinonychus, though Deinonychus was considerably larger, about 11 feet long and 150 pounds. The name means terrible claw, and it was appropriate, a large sickle-shaped retractable claw on each hind foot, clearly designed for restraining and slashing prey. The skeleton suggested an animal built for speed agility and active predation. This did not fit the swamp dinosaur model. This animal looked like it moved the way a hawk moves, dynamically, quickly, with purpose. Its skeleton suggested a high metabolism, a warm-blooded, fast, active predator. Ostrom spent years studying Deinonychus and its implications, and in the early 1970s, he published his formal argument: birds are the direct descendants of small theropod dinosaurs, not archosaur generalists. As Heilman had argued, theropods, specifically Maniraptoran theropods, the group that included Deinonychus and its relatives, the dromaeosaurids. The response from the paleontological establishment was, to put it diplomatically, skeptical. Ostrom had resurrected an idea that had been set aside for 40 years. The field had moved on. Some colleagues were dismissive, some were openly hostile. He kept going. In 1973, while visiting a European museum to study a pterosaur specimen, Ostrom noticed that what had been labeled a pterosaur in one drawer was actually a specimen of Archaeopteryx that had been misidentified for over 100 years. The classification error had been made in the late 19th century, and nobody had looked closely enough to correct it. The animal that proved the dinosaur-bird link had been sitting in the wrong drawer. Ostrom's work in the 1970s rebuilt the case from the ground up, detailed comparisons of over 20 skeletal features shared between Archaeopteryx and theropod dinosaurs. Wishbones, the clavicle issue that had sunk Heilman's acceptance of the idea, were confirmed in multiple theropod species. The anatomical objection collapsed. By the early 1980s, the scientific consensus had shifted. By the 1990s, it was effectively settled. Birds are theropod dinosaurs. But the argument had required a single individual to spend a decade making a case his field initially rejected, to find a mislabeled fossil sitting in a museum drawer and to reconstruct piece by piece a connection that the evidence had been pointing towards since 1861. The field needed more than theory. It needed the quarries of northeastern China to open up. Number 4, feathers before flight. Feathers are older than birds. That single fact rewrote the entire story. In the early 1990s, farmers in Liaoning province in northeastern China began finding fossils. Liaoning sits on top of a deposit of fine-grained volcanic sediment laid down roughly 125 to 130 million years ago. A Lagerstätte, the technical term for an exceptionally rich fossil deposit, and what it preserved was extraordinary. Feathered dinosaurs, not birds. Dinosaurs that unambiguously did not fly. Some were too large. Some had the wrong limb proportions. Some had feathers covering their bodies in configurations that ruled out flight entirely, but that had feathers, complex, structured, keratinous feathers preserved in stone. The first major find was Sinosauropteryx, announced in 1996A. Small Compsognathid, a close relative of the Compsognathus, that Huxley had compared to Archaeopteryx over a century earlier, covered in simple filamentous protofeathers, not flight feathers, not wing feathers, insulating body covering. Then Caudipteryx, a small oviraptor relative with genuine pernicious feathers on its arms and tail, arranged symmetrically. The symmetry tells you they were not for flight, because flight feathers are asymmetric but structurally complex. Nonetheless. Then Microraptor A, small dromaeosaurid velociraptor's family with 4 wings. 4 full flight feathers on both the arms and the legs. It almost certainly glided, possibly flew using a configuration that looked unlike any modern bird, but that showed the complex interaction between feathers, limbs, and aerodynamics in the period before modern bird flight was stabilized. What the Liaoning fossils established was a fact that completely reframed the origin of birds. Feathers did not evolve for flight. Feathers evolved first for other purposes: thermoregulation display, camouflage, possibly waterproofing, and only later were exapted into the flight apparatus we associate with modern birds. This matters beyond the academic question of bird origins. It means that for tens of millions of years, a huge range of dinosaurs, certainly the Maniraptoran theropods, possibly more broadly, were feathered animals, not scaly reptiles with an accidental feather feathery mutation in one lineage. A large group of dinosaurs for whom feathers were a normal, maintained, functional part of their biology. Some of those Liaoning fossils preserved something even more remarkable. Structures called melanosomes, the tiny organelles inside cells, that produce color were preserved in the feathers. Melanosomes have characteristic shapes depending on what pigment they produced, and those shapes can be read from fossils under an electron microscope. Sinosauropteryx had a reddish-brown and white-striped tail. Microraptor had iridescent black feathers. Anchiornis, a small theropod from the late Jurassic, had a black and white speckled body with a reddish-brown head crest and reddish-brown patches around the face. We know what color a dinosaur was, not as inference, not as guess, as direct physical evidence preserved in rock. The feathered, colored, active, metabolically complex animals that had been living through the Cretaceous for 80 million years hit the end of the Cretaceous with all of that refinement behind them, and most of them died. The story of which one survived requires understanding exactly how bad the filter was. Number 5, the world that burned. The asteroid did not just kill dinosaurs, it nearly ended everything. At approximately 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 6 miles in diameter struck the shallow sea covering what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact released energy estimated at roughly 1 billion times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The impact site, the Chicxulub crater, is 93 miles wide and is visible today in gravitational anomaly data of the Gulf of Mexico. What followed was not a single event. It was a sequence. The immediate impact vaporized rock, superheated the atmosphere locally, and sent a shockwave around the planet. Within hours, ejected debris, re-entering the atmosphere, superheated the air globally, potentially raising surface temperatures high enough to ignite wildfires across entire continents. Some models suggest the initial thermal pulse killed large animals on land within hours over areas far removed from the impact. Then the longer kill, the debris cloud and sulfate aerosols from vaporized rock, blocked sunlight. Global temperatures dropped, photosynthesis collapsed. The foundation of nearly every terrestrial food web plants failed. For months, possibly years, the world was dark and cold and largely without primary production. Then a third layer. As the dust settled over years and decades trapped, carbon dioxide began warming the planet back. The KPG boundary, the geological layer that marks the end of the Cretaceous, is a thin, dark line in rock formations worldwide. On one side, a diverse, complex biosphere. On the other, near silence, the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared at or very close to that line, worldwide simultaneously by geological standards. But here is the key reframe. The impact was a filter, not a sweep. It did not kill everything, regardless of characteristics. It selected against specific traits with devastating efficiency, large body size, because large animals need enormous caloric input, and that input had largely ceased to exist. Dependence on specific food sources like prey, or specific plants. Long generation times, inability to burrow or take cover from the thermal pulse. It selected for the opposite small body size, low caloric needs, flexible diet, short generation time, and the ability to exploit the things that survived the initial destruction, specifically seeds and dormant plant material stored in soil insects, feeding on decomposing matter and aquatic resources. The question is which animals hit the impact with the right combination of those traits, and the answer in the sky is almost none of the dominant ones, because the birds of the Cretaceous were, with very few exceptions, not built like the birds that survived. They had spent 80 million years perfecting themselves for a world that was about to cease to exist. Number 6, the birds that died. The birds that ruled the Cretaceous sky are completely gone. The survivors were the ones nobody noticed. This is the part that gets left out of the standard version. It is often presented as dinosaurs died, birds survived. That framing erases a very important middle step. The birds of the Cretaceous were not like modern birds. They were a diverse, complex radiation of species that had been evolving for roughly 80 million years by the time the asteroid hit. They had filled many of the same ecological niches that modern birds occupy. They were the dominant flying vertebrates of the Mesozoic sky, dominant over pterosaurs, which were already in decline by the late Cretaceous, and most of them died. The dominant Cretaceous bird group was the Enantiornithes opposite birds, named for a detail of how their shoulder bones connected the reverse of the arrangement in modern birds. The Enantiornithines were spectacularly successful for their time. They ranged from small sparrow-sized forms to larger raptorial species. They had teeth and clawed wings. They nested in trees. They probably had complex behaviors. Their fossils are found worldwide. They are completely gone. Not a single Enantiornithine lineage survived the KP boundary. The other major Cretaceous bird group, the Hesperornithiforms, was entirely gone by the boundary as well. These were large, diving, flightless birds of the late Cretaceous, something like a cross between a loon and a penguin with teeth fully aquatic. None of them survived. The toothed birds, the ones carrying the visible ancestral features from their theropod heritage, the teeth that Archaeopteryx had, all died. What survived were animals from a third lineage, the neorniths, the modern birds. And even within neorniths, the diversity at the KPG boundary was thin. The models suggest that the modern bird radiation we see today, the songbirds, the raptors, the parrots, the shorebirds, the waterfowl, all of it descends from a very small founding population that made it through the filter. Some estimates suggest as few as a handful of ancestral lineages survived the boundary. The modern tree of bird, life 11,000 species fans out from what was at the end of the Cretaceous, a very narrow neck. Why did those particular lineages make it when the enantiornithines, which had 80 million years of success behind them, did not? The answer comes down to a single anatomical feature and a single environmental fact that combined to make a small, probably unremarkable group of birds, the inheritors of the planet. Number 7, the one feature that decided everything. A beak, not intelligence. Not size A, beak decided who lived. The leading hypothesis for why modern birds survived when the enantiornithines did not is called the granivore hypothesis. It is built on one observation. Modern birds have beaks. Enantiornithines had teeth. In normal ecological conditions, this distinction is largely irrelevant. Teeth are useful. Beaks are useful. Both work for different things. But at the KPG boundary, in the months and years after the impact, the global vegetation collapse meant that the most abundant food source on land was seeds. Seeds buried in soil dormant, waiting. Seeds that had been produced by the forests and grasslands before the impact and that persisted in the ground after the canopy burned. Teeth are for gripping and processing live prey and soft vegetable matter, a beak. Specifically, the robust seed-cracking beak that several neornithine lineages possessed can process hard, dry seeds efficiently. It is a specialized tool for a food source that became essentially overnight the most reliably available caloric resource on the post-impact planet. The enantiornithines were predominantly tree dwellers. They lived in forest canopies that either burned or died. Their food sources, insects, small vertebrates, soft fruit collapsed with the forests. Their teeth could not do what a seed-cracking beak does. They were exquisitely adapted for a world that had just stopped existing. The neornithines that survived were not necessarily the most impressive or the most successful Cretaceous birds. They were probably the birds that happened to have flexible, generalized diets centered on resources that happened to persist through the worst of the environmental collapse. The second factor compounds the first ground dwelling versus canopy dwelling. Wildfires destroyed forest canopy on a massive scale in the weeks and months after the impact. Birds that lived in trees, roosted in trees, and nested in trees lost their entire habitat structure. Birds that were already ground-associated, already foraging. In soil already nesting on or near the ground were somewhat buffered from the immediate loss of the canopy. The third factor is body size and generation time. Small birds can survive on very little food. Small birds breed faster, producing more generations in less time, which means they can adapt via natural selection to new conditions far more rapidly than large, slow-breeding animals. The immediate post. Impact environment rewarded smallness with survival. None of these three factors is individually decisive. The honest reading of the evidence is that survival was probabilistic, a confluence of the right traits at the right moment, not a designed outcome. Some lineages that seemed well adapted for the post-impact world did not make it. Some that seem unlikely on paper did, but the pattern holds. The survivors were small ground-associated, flexible dieted, beaked birds, and the dominant Cretaceous birds tree-dwelling, toothed canopy-dependent were almost entirely gone by the time the dust settled. One fossil found in Belgium and announced in 2020 puts a face on what the survivor stock actually looked like. Number 8, the wonder chicken. They found the face of the survivor. It was 667 million years old, and it looked like a chicken Asteroid maastrichtensis, nicknamed the wonder chicken. Discovered in limestone from the Maastricht Formation in Belgium, dated to approximately 667 million years ago, less than 700,000 years before the KPG boundary, which, in geological terms, is essentially the last breath of the Cretaceous. The fossil is fragmentary, but includes a well-preserved skull, and the skull is remarkable because of how modern it looks. The brain case and the arrangement of the facial bones place Asteriornis close to the common ancestor of two major modern bird groups, the Galoancerae, the group that includes chickens, turkeys, pheasants, and ducks. The wonder chicken appears to sit near the base of the lineage that would eventually produce the birds that currently dominate both farmyards and wetlands worldwide. Its skull shows a small, lightly built bird with features consistent with a ground-associated lifestyle. No teeth, modern-looking beak architecture, size consistent with small, low-caloric need survival. Asteriornis is not the only late Cretaceous neornithine. There is Vagavus III found in Antarctica, dated to about 66 to 68 million years ago, which appears to be related to the ancestors of ducks and geese, and is probably the oldest definitively identified member of a modern bird group. There is Janovis phenolidans described in 2022 from Belgian material, also close to the KPG boundary, showing that the split between major modern bird lineages had already happened before the asteroid hit. The ancestors of today's diverse bird families were already present, already diverging, already spreading before the impact arrived. This changes the framing slightly. The modern bird radiation is often presented as entirely a post-impact phenomenon that birds diversified into available niches only after the non-avian dinosaurs cleared out. That is partly true, but the founding lineages were already established. The split had already happened. The asteroid did not create the ancestors of modern birds. It killed almost everything around them, and they filled the space that was left. Asteriornis was probably a small, unremarkable ground-feeding bird by Cretaceous standards, not a dominant animal, not at the top of anything. 700,000 years later, the asteroid arrived, the world it lived in was destroyed, and something in its lineage survived. From that, survival came chickens, ducks, songbirds, eagles, hummingbirds, penguins, and ostriches. From something that looked like a small, unimpressive ground bird, an entire world of animals grew. Number 9, the explosion. In less time than it takes a mountain range to fully rise, a handful of survivors became 10,000 species. The modern bird radiation, the diversification of neornithines into the roughly 11,000 species alive today, is one of the fastest major evolutionary radiations in the vertebrate fossil record. After the KPG boundary, the world that the surviving birds found was largely empty. The non-avian, dinosaurs that had occupied every terrestrial niche for over 150 million years were gone. The giant sauropods that had stripped the canopy were gone. The large theropods that had dominated the food chain were gone. The pterosaurs were gone. The dominant sea reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were gone. The enantiornithine birds that had filled the aerial niches of the Mesozoic were gone. The surviving neornithines radiated into this emptiness with a speed that the fossil record documents in broad strokes and molecular phylogenetics documents in fine detail. The neoavs, the group that contains roughly 95% of all living bird species, essentially everything except the ducks, chickens, and their closest relatives, appears to have diversified explosively in the first few million years. Of the Paleogene period, the post-impact world was not immediately hospitable. But as the planet stabilized, as new forests grew, as new ecological networks assembled over hundreds of thousands and then millions of years, the birds were there for all of it, adapting, specializing, filling niches that the Cretaceous ecosystem had occupied with entirely different animals. The songbirds, the passerines, which make up roughly 60% of all living bird species, appear in the fossil record and molecular clock estimates as diversifying rapidly, probably driven by the global spread of flowering plant-dominated forests in the Eocene epoch. The parrots radiated, the raptors radiated, the wading birds, the seabirds, the shorebirds. Each radiation correlates broadly with the emergence or expansion of the ecological niches they now occupy. The hummingbird is among the most physiologically extreme animals on the planet, a heart rate during hovering flight of up to 1,200 beats per minute, the ability to enter a state of torpor to survive cold nights, and a flight mechanism unlike any other bird. It is the refined product of 66 million years of uninterrupted dinosaur evolution after the asteroid, as is the ostrich, which abandoned flight and grew to 9 feet tall and 320 pounds, as is the penguin, which abandoned the air for the water entirely, as is the Arctic tern, which migrates roughly 44000 miles annually from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back every single year. All of these animals trace a direct unbroken lineage to a small feathered theropod in the Cretaceous undergrowth. There is no gap in that line. No moment where one thing ended and another began. A continuous thread of living biology from the Mesozoic to the present day. By the only count that matters, species alive on the planet right now, we do not live in the age of mammals. The age of mammals is a human-centric framing based on which large animals most resemble us. By species count, by diversity, by geographic range, we live in the continued age of dinosaurs, the same unbroken age that began in the Triassic and that the asteroid narrowed but did not end. There are more species of living birds than there are species of living mammals, not slightly more, roughly twice as many. The explosion that started from the narrow neck of KPG survivors produced more diversity than the entire mammalian radiation. That is what survives when the filter lets you through. Number 10, the dinosaur in your kitchen. The last one is not in a museum, it is in your fridge. There is a chicken in billions of refrigerators worldwide right now. Its scientific name is Gallus domesticus. It is descended from the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia, domesticated roughly 8,000 years ago, one of the earliest animals domesticated by humans, and now the most numerous bird on the planet with an estimated 33 billion individuals alive at any given time. A chicken has hollow bones, it has a wishbone, the furcula, the fused clavicle that theropod dinosaurs possessed, and that the entire debate over bird origins partially partially hinged on. It has three-toed feet with the same arrangement that left tracks in Cretaceous mud. It has a scaled lower leg and foot that is the least modified part of the theropod anatomy preserved more ore. Less intact across 150 million years of evolution. In 2007, a team led by Mary Schweitzer extracted soft tissue, specifically collagen proteins, from the femur of a T-Rex that had been dead for 68 million years. When they sequenced the protein and looked for molecular matches in living animals, the closest living match was chicken. In 2015, developmental biologist Bart Ongenbuehler and geneticist Arkhot Abjanov at Harvard identified the genetic switch responsible for the transition from the elongated dinosaur snout to the bird beak. By blocking two specific proteins during chicken embryo development, they caused embryos to develop a snout structure more closely resembling the ancestral dinosaur face. The birds themselves carry the genetic instructions for their ancestral anatomy. Those instructions are suppressed. They are not deleted. The genome of a chicken still contains the blueprint for something closer to a theropod dinosaur. The evolutionary path did not erase the history. It layered over it. Jack Horner, the paleontologist whose fieldwork was part of the inspiration for the character Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, has spent years proposing the concept of the Chickenosaurus, not recreating dinosaurs. From ancient DNA, which is not recoverable on those timescales, but reverse engineering dinosaurian traits by activating latent ancestral genetics in living bird embryos, turning back on the tail that bird embryos develop and then reabsorb during development, reactivating the clawed digits, expressing the full ancestral snout structure. This has not produced a walking, fire-breathing Cretaceous predator. The science remains at the embryological proof of concept stage, but the fact that it is biologically conceivable that the ancestral genetic instructions are present, readable, and activatable in a living chicken is a statement about what birds actually are. They are not the descendants of dinosaurs in the way that you are, the descendant of something ancient and different. The line from theropod to bird is unbroken. There was no moment when one thing became another. There was a gradual accumulation of changes across tens of millions of years, from an animal that looked like Deinonychus to an animal that looks like a robin. No gap, no discontinuity, a continuous lineage, 66 million years of which happened after an asteroid nearly ended it entirely. The event that ended the Mesozoic did not end the dinosaurs. It ended most of them. It ended the giant ones, the dominant ones, the ones we built museums around, the ones we made into childhood obsessions and blockbuster films. But one branch of the theropod family, small and feathered, and probably entirely unremarkable by the standards of the Cretaceous, threaded the needle. It survived the darkness. It survived the cold. It survived the collapse of every ecosystem it had evolved. Within over 80 million years, it bred fast enough and ate flexibly enough and stayed small enough to make it through the years when almost nothing else could. And then it had 66 million years of empty world to fill. Every bird on the planet is the result. The pigeon on your windowsill, the eagle over the ridge, the penguin in the Antarctic current, the Arctic tern crossing the planet twice a year. The chicken in your kitchen. They did not escape the asteroid. They survived it. And that is the difference between an ending and a continuation. The dinosaurs did not go extinct. They are still here.